Officially, as a career, I'm a Christian ethicist. I like to confessionally describe myself as theological ethics, a theological ethicist. And the work that drives me in theological ethics, one might say, to use the technical term of the field, is theological anthropology. So the way we think about humanity in relationship to God. In general, one might say that theology or Christianity has calibrated humanity. We got a helicopter going over now. It's going by, okay.
It's life.
Is that what it means to be human in the West has been calibrated to a false and very harmful ideal with regards to the notion of race. Race is not something that is, it's not an ongoing conversation in the Bible. It's not historical. It's as old as the United States and as recent as the slave trade. And it's fixed what we understand to be human around the notion of an ideal. And it is the recalibration of humanity, especially theologically. Theology is just one of the engines to mobilize this distorted notion of human.
What was the ideal and who fixed it?
Well, the ideal is white. When we talk about race, we're really not talking about categories of human being. We're really talking about a central idealized human being around which all of humanity gravitates, and various manifestations we describe as diversity. But it's the category is an ideal, and that's the fixture. All of the history of race has been the effort to stabilize this central notion of white. Christ becomes an idealized human being, white.
You're saying Jesus is not white?
Yeah, I'm saying Jesus is not white. I'm saying the notion of Jesus as white, the understanding of Jesus as white, corresponds with the history of idealized humanity that has damaged really the whole world. Practices of domination, imperialism, colonization, cruelty, the pursuit of ideal communities populated with ideal people. That is the structure. That's what racism is. Systems and structures for whites only. And theologically, Christianity has been a partnering engine, or at least a mobilizing engine. Different manifestations of Christianity has been a mobilizing engine for the practice of idealized humanity, which is basically white supremacy. Why does the church partner with the dominant narrative? Some may argue that the church does not partner with the dominant narrative, that the church has been a mobilizing force of the dominant narrative. That, for example, in the practice of colonization, I'm forgetting, I believe it's the 15th century, that Treaty of Tordesillas, if I'm pronouncing that correct, gave colonies, the practice of colonies, the empire, in the practice of colonization, authority over the churches within their colonies, split the Western world between the East and the West, over in the West, and gave Portugal and Spain power over the colonies within their, power over the churches within their colonies. They basically split the world. The Pope gave the world in a manner not unlike, the Promised Land, which was a supersessionist practice that saw the church as the true Israel and the chosen people, the ideal people. That language of the chosen people, the Christian, co-opting of the narrative of Israel, was a mobilizing force for Europeans having authority over everything related to heaven and earth.
I didn't learn that in church.
Yeah, related to heaven and earth, everything. And it was, more than just religion was at stake, however. Religion was a mobilizing force for land grabbing, for financial acquisition, especially in the way that Christianity gave logic to the buying and selling of human beings in the slave trade. So the legitimizing process of buying and selling human beings in the practice of capitalism in the West, all of that stuff calibrated humanity and Christianity towards this ideal, white, masculine, European. Now, that is a Christianity. That's not Christianity writ large. That is a Christianity. That's a very dominant Christianity in the West, but it's not Christianity in total. Just like just like there have been different kinds of Christians in the Western world. Let me back up. There have been different kinds of Christians, much like there was also different kinds of practices of Judaism. You get your Sadducees, and you get your Pharisees, you get your priestly class, and so forth. And then you have followers of the way. Some were in cahoots with the empire, others were crucified by the empire. And they were all Jewish people. We've got Christians who are in cahoots with the empire and Christians who have stood in opposition to the empire following Christ, a different Christ than the one who is idealized as white and European.
Where is Christ?
Christ is always with those whose backs are pressed against the wall by politically oppressive regimes. I borrow from Howard Thurman when I say that. Christ is where he says, in Matthew 25, in society as the hungry, as the imprisoned, as the naked, as the thirsty.
Those are metaphors.
They're metaphors in a sense, but they are also ontological truths. So, and I wrote a book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer's experience in Harlem. And I think there's something to learn from what Bonhoeffer says when he describes who Jesus is. He describes Jesus as Stellvertretung.
As what?
Stellvertretung, it's a German word. It's a big German word. It means vicarious representation. To put it short, when we in our sin and our shame can't stand before God, Christ stands in for us, becomes vicarious representation for all of humankind. And he believes that that's an ontological thing. Christ has stood in for all of us. We find ourselves now only in Christ. When you encounter another human being, you're not encountering just that other human being. You're also encountering Christ, who stands in for all of humanity. So when we have our pursuits of ideals, and this person aesthetically does not fit the ideal, aesthetically, financially, sexually, whatever, they don't fit the ideal, and you shun that person as you're looking for the ideal community. You are not shunning just another person. That person comes to you as Christ comes to you. You are shunning Christ, which is an important understanding. So when he says in Matthew 25, I was hungry and you did not feed me. I was thirsty, you did not give me drink. That's not just metaphor. That's not just, I'm disappointed that you treated somebody else like that. You have an opportunity to love Christ in your interaction with your neighbor. Wendell Berry has written an interesting book called The Hidden Wound. It's an old book. But in this book, he talks about the plight of the slave owner in church with his slave. And he says he talks about the language of plight when he's talking about its faith. When this person recognizes that the slave that he owns has a body with a soul that's as worthy of salvation as his own. What happens to his Christianity in that regard? You recognizing that person has a soul that's as worthy of salvation as his own. His Christianity becomes abstract, becomes about doctrine only, about right belief. Abstract and hyper-spiritual, not about concrete social interaction, because that would disrupt his practice of slavery, his practice of owning a person's body. It becomes about belief. We shed the gospel of social concerns, about I-thou interaction, turn it into spiritual stuff and right doctrine. That's the plight of a lot of our Christianity in America. where we can have so many churches all over the country and high numbers of incarceration, high numbers of poverty, high numbers of homeless people, which are primarily children. We're all these Christians in America. Christians who understand the connection between Jesus and justice are different than Christians who do not. Christians who understand the connection between Jesus and justice are more apt to be concerned about social interaction with the neighbor, about social interaction, about systems and structures. The language of relationship, even I'll problematize that a little bit because it can be reduced to individuals, which is a very Western and American thing. And when you have life and meaning reduced to the individual in individual social interactions, you miss the way that systems and structures have been arranged as biopolitical schemes around the ideal human being, to organize societies biopolitically around the notion of the ideal person for the ideal community. You miss that when you talk about individuals and individual relationships. It's very evangelical, which is historically very problematic. It's important to pay attention to systems and structures. How do you get to that? How do you talk about that? Well, understanding a connection between the way of Jesus and justice is very important. Jesus was not talking about righteousness in an individual sense, which is a hypermorality even. It gets the language righteousness can be understood as kind of a hypermorality. Here, again, read individual moral pursuits. But righteousness also understood, tzedakah, mishpat, biblical words that also translate into justice. And here, justice understood in a restorative sense, when in the Garden of Eden, example, relationship when Adam and Eve sinned, broke the covenant. They broke relationship between God and humanity, between humankind and the rest of creation, and between each other. Justice in that regard is not retribution or them being punished and punishment fitting the crime, but the restoration of relationship between each other, and between them and God, and between humankind and one another, between humankind and creation. It's the restoration. And that would be a better way of understanding what the way of Jesus is restoring, setting relationships right, which you don't have when you have a notion of one ideal human, or ideal humanity, ideal human types, in community for ideal human types, and just individual relationships. You got to break down the systems and structures that continue to dominate and separate people, argue for the practices of capitalism that leave people in poverty and suffering, and so forth.
What gives you hope that we can begin that can be broken open so that through that there'd be a new creation, a new we?
What gives me hope about the possibility of undoing systems and structures that abuse and oppress is that it's not my job only. And I'm not passing the buck here. I'm talking about participating with God in what God is doing in Christ in the world. And here, Christ not as a fetishized, idealized thing, an object, an idol of the worship of white supremacy, which is what a lot of Christianity is. But the Christ who is present in Palestine as a poor Jew in a colonized state, speaking thus saith the Lord in a prophetic sense to undo systems and structures. A Jesus of liberation. This is God's work in the world. And those of us who say yes to Christ are saying yes to this, to participating with Christ, with God, in what God is doing in Christ in the world. That's hope. And in order for, I love this quote from Paulo Freire, and I'll paraphrase it, but in order for the oppressed to wage their war for their freedom, they must see oppression not as a closed room in which there is no escape, but as a moment, as a situation in which we can, and I'm paraphrasing still, open a door. Hope in the process of oppression, or in the context of oppression, is what drives us towards liberation. And Christ is our hope.